I'm aware that in YouTube land, if you don't update for over 6 weeks, it's assumed that you've died. I haven't died, but basically I had a quite substantial amount of time set aside that I was going to do this in, and then several things went wrong one after the other during the time I thought I would have off from other responsibilities, and then by the time that was all dealt with, I had to go back to my other stuff again, so this is late. And also I was spending so much time apologising in the comments for not having anything up yet that that ironically was slowing me down. So prior to the Old Hunters DLC coming out, there was a popular fan theory, and it's one that I agreed with, that Laurence, the founder of the Healing Church, eventually transformed into the Chalice Dungeon boss that we know of as the Bloodletting Beast. The game never explicitly linked the two, but there was a fair amount of essentially circumstantial evidence that suggested, if Laurence is in the game, he's more likely to be the Bloodletting Beast than anything else. And I covered most of this in a video I did on the Hunter's Dream a while back. But then the DLC came out, and the DLC included a boss that is explicitly identified as being Laurence, and this boss is fought in the Hunter's Nightmare, and it looks exactly like the Cleric Beast boss that we fight at the start of the game, except that it's on fire. So what I want to look at now is, has that put the kibosh on the whole Laurence is the Bloodletting Beast thing, and we just have to accept that he's this, or is there more to it? So, to begin with, I want to look at the way that the Bloodletting Beast is fought in the waking world, while the first Vicar is fought in the Hunter's Nightmare. Now, the Hunter's Nightmare, like the rest of the Dreamlands, isn't bound by the same physical rules as the waking world is. The most obvious example of this is that in order to fight Laurence, you have to retrieve Laurence's own skull and then give it to him, which is, of course, physically impossible. The description of the skull reads as follows. Skull of Laurence, first Vicar of the Healing Church. In reality, he became the first Cleric Beast, and his human skull only exists in the Nightmare. The skull is a symbol of Laurence's past and what he failed to protect. He is destined to seek the skull, but even if he found it, it could never restore his memories. So, in other words, it's something that never physically existed. So Laurence is fixated on losing his humanity and becoming a beast, which causes a symbol of his humanity to manifest physically in the Nightmare. In the same way that, for example, memories of the Grand Cathedral at different points in its time have manifested as two completely separate Grand Cathedrals. So basically, we can't entirely trust what we see in the Dreamlands to accurately represent what happened in the waking world. So we'll leave the Dreamlands for now and just look at the evidence that we have in the waking world. And in the waking world, we find Laurence's real rather than symbolic skull. So looking at the skull, what is immediately striking about it is that it looks like a primate skull, not a canine skull. This is important because looking at the first Vicar and the Cleric Beast, their heads are very canine looking. They have a long muzzle like a wolf. So the skull we have on the altar that is definitively Laurence's skull doesn't match the Cleric Beast or the first Vicar. It's certainly a beast of some kind, but it doesn't look like that kind of beast. Now, there's actually a notable, I'll call it a canine primate divide. The beasts that we find will tend toward looking like either wolves, the Scourge Beasts, Amelia, the Beast-Possessed Souls, the Cleric Beast, or they'll look like a person in basically bad werewolf makeup. So that's Gascoigne, the Beast Patience, the Abhorrent Beast, and of course the Bloodletting Beast. So the skull looks more like it belongs to the latter group than it does the former. So to recap the arguments around the Bloodletting Beast that I made in the original video, when we first encounter the Bloodletting Beast in the Chalices, he has a large wound on his head that roughly, if not exactly, corresponds to the fracture that we find in Laurence's skull. The next time we encounter the Bloodletting Beast, the head has been removed entirely, which means that its skull is missing. The second form of the Bloodletting Beast is also fought directly before Queen Yharnam, and its Japanese name is Kemenochi no Aruji, which translates to Lord of the Beast Blood. Taken together, that makes the bloodletting beast seem like it's supposed to be a significant point in the story, although it's never explained. And of course, Laurence is a former Bergenworth scholar who brought the blood to Yharnam to begin with, so he would know about the underground labyrinth, and Lord of the Beast Blood is a fitting title for him. So, while none of this is explicit, it does suggest that, okay, if the skull is going to come from anything in the game, the bloodletting beast is the most likely candidate. So the bloodletting beast probably Laurence. The skull's not a perfect match for the bloodletting beast because the snout protrudes slightly too far. Although keep in mind that once you add layers of muscle and skin and cartilage and hair to that skull, the face would become flatter. You can see this if you look at ape skulls versus ape faces. So it's not a perfect match, but the fact that we have this roughly primate creature with a gash in its head and then a skull that has a fracture in the same place that looks like it's from a primate, then we find out the creature's head was removed. Even if you take the DLC into account, the skull still looks way more like it came from the bloodletting beast than anything else in the game. But then there's this boss in the nightmare that is explicitly identified as Laurence, and the skull really doesn't look like it came from that. So how do we explain this? So, to start with, we know that the form that your consciousness takes in the Dreamlands doesn't have to correspond one-to-one with your physical body. A good example is Mikolash. Mikolash's physical body is a mummified corpse, and we actually have no idea how long he's been dead for, but he is alive and well and no worse for wear, physically anyway, in the Dreamlands. There's also Maria. We're told that Maria threw her rakuyo away in the fishing hamlet, but when we face her in the nightmare, she's still using it. The strangest case is probably Volta. Volta's form in the Dreamlands can change. If you summon him prior to his death, we get the version of Volta that we meet in the Forbidden Woods, where he's basically falling apart physically and psychologically, and he wears the Master's Iron Helm. If we complete Volta's questline and allow him to die, we can still summon him, but when we do so, he appears to be in his prime again. He looks to be a younger, healthier man. Interesting because by completing Volta's quest, he tells you that
this was my last, most pressing task.
As if the difference comes down to whether or not he is burdened with the task of being Master of the League. So, Laurence's form doesn't need to correspond exactly to how he looked in the waking world. What's significant about Laurence's form here isn't just that it's modelled on a cleric beast, it's the flames. Nightmare Laurence, the first vicar, whatever you want to call it, has not been set on fire. He's not burning from the outside. The heat is coming from inside of him and it's escaping through holes in his skin. It actually gets brighter and more intense when he wakes up from his slumber, and it looks very much like the fire is actually his blood, which it makes clear when you get him down to a certain health level, he will fall in half, and he will start bleeding and vomiting out this lava as if it's a bodily fluid. Now, beasts have an instinctive fear of fire. It's well-founded because beasts take extra damage from fire. There are some beasts that can manipulate fire in a way that looks like Dark Souls-style pyromancy. The beast-possessed soul is one, the Lauren cleric is another. There's also the silver beasts who, while they can't create fire, they can use burning sticks to breathe out clouds of flame like a magician. The thing about Laurence, though, is that he's different in that the flames are consuming him, and that's not something we see in any beasts. The closest thing we see to it is the Watchdog of the Old Lords, which mechanically is a beast, but it seems like it's a strange animal that the Thumerians kept, not someone who transformed. Transformed beasts tend to keep human characteristics of some kind, while the Watchdog looks like it was always a quadruped canine. So it's odd that Laurence would become the fire equivalent of Paarl. So I think we have to take the flames here, like the skull, as a symbolic thing that the nightmare has reified, rather than a recreation of real-world flames. The argument's been put forward that Laurence is on fire here because he died burning, possibly during the burning of Old Yharnam, and I'm sympathetic toward that, although I'm not sure how the timeline of Old Yharnam actually works. The problem is, though, is again that the fire is internal. He hasn't been set on fire, his body has turned to fire. So what I would suggest here is that the form Laurence takes in the nightmare is a reflection of his experiences with the old blood rather than a recreation of anything physical, and that the bloodletting beast is his physical body left behind in the waking world. In the same way that Laurence's past as a human with human memories that he fails to hold on to manifests in the nightmare as a physical skull that we can carry around with us, the pain and horror that Laurence felt as he realized that this blood was tearing his body apart makes his, I guess, consciousness manifest as a beast possessed by burning blood. This might actually be why the bloodletting beast ended up being called the bloodletting beast, because it's trying to convey that Laurence is trying to either halt or reverse his condition through bloodletting, getting this old blood out of his system. The description of the bloodletter weapon that we get in the DLC from Brador even says that bloodletting was believed, probably incorrectly, to be the only effective means of expelling tainted blood. So, if the bloodletting beast is Laurence, then Laurence is already dead. The skulls in the cathedral and the headless version that's moving around in Thumaru Ihil, that's not actually the bloodletting beast, really. That's the bloodletting beast's corpse functioning as the host to this massive parasite. So we can say that Laurence died in the waking world as the bloodletting beast, then his consciousness was reborn in the nightmare as the first vicar, thus explaining how there can be two of him. As to why Laurence in the nightmare looks like a cleric beast, Laurence's skull states that Laurence became the first cleric beast, and the boss we fight is literally the same model as the cleric beast boss in the game, right down to having nails on its leg in the same spot. Now, prior to the DLC, I had assumed that cleric beast just meant a beast who used to be a cleric. So the one that we fight on the bridge was just an anonymous cleric who transformed, while Gascoigne and Amelia are cleric beasts, but we know their proper names. So it's not like there's a specific thing called a cleric beast, it's just a beast that is a cleric. Then the DLC shows up, and between Laurence's skull, the first Vicar boss fight, and Brador's hat, it starts suggesting that cleric beast is actually a singular kind of beast that clerics turn into. Now, there might be something in that, because if you look at Amelia, if you look at the cleric beast boss and what's left of the beast Brador killed, they don't look identical, but they have horns, they have whitish grey fur. Amelia and the cleric beast both have canine skull shapes. It's impossible to tell with Brador because it's only the scalp of the creature. So it could be that there were common traits to the beasts that clerics turned into for whatever reason, even though each beast ultimately looked unique. So I think that, like the skull and like the burning blood, the form that Laurence has taken is symbolic. His life is essentially defined by the failure of the healing church, so his consciousness has taken on a form that embodies his failure. He becomes a cleric beast filled with burning blood that's desperate to recover its lost humanity. You can make this argument for a lot of things, actually, in the Hunter's Nightmare. Ludwig, for example. Ludwig's beast form is completely unlike anything else we've seen. Not only is it equine, but it has an additional mouth, and it almost seems to be two different creatures that have been fused together, which is not something that we see in the beasts that we run into in the waking world. And one of the things that I've stressed about the Hunter's Nightmare when I've talked about it is that it looks like it's been specifically patterned on depictions of Buddhist hell. And in one of the Buddhist hells, sinners are tortured by a horse-headed monster. So if Ludwig is weighed down by all of the people that he killed and tortured as a hunter, that could explain why he takes the form of this monstrous horse. It could also explain the Orphan of Kos. The orphan that we run into is an adult, but for some reason is still attached to a placenta and inside his mother's body. This makes very little rational sense, but you could say that the orphan dies, it never has a chance to grow. Then its consciousness survives in the dreamlands, and over time it grows to adulthood, but remains essentially trapped within its mother's body because it was never properly born. But this whole train of thought is leading me to another point, which is... So prior to the DLC, I had a pretty simple explanation of what was happening with all these things in the Dreamlands. And that was that the Dreamlands were another dimension that you could travel to and from, but was also home to various creatures which I assumed were just native life forms. So things like crawlers, the giant lost children, the silver beasts, the amygdala, etc., were the natural fauna of this world, probably left over from Laurence. So characters like Mikolash and Edgar, and enemies like the slime scholars, had been brought there from outside. And I stressed this very heavily in the previous episode I did on the Hunter's Dream, and the reason I was doing that is because a lot of people were assuming that the game worked basically like Inception, and we were inside actual dreams that people were having. And then the Hunter's Nightmare showed up and ruined everything. The Hunter's Nightmare is presented to us as a kind of afterlife, where the souls of the old hunters have become trapped as punishment for what happened at the fishing hamlet. So when we run into Maria, Yamamura, Ludwig, possibly Antal, what's left of Gratia, okay, they're hunters, they've succumbed to the curse and they've become trapped here, fine. But they're not the only things here. And there are things that we run into in the Hunter's Nightmare that we recognize as native to the waking world, but at the same time shouldn't really be here, if we're using that old model of how the Dreamlands worked. Now, there are some concessions we can make that explain how some of these things got here. For example, there's an eye collector right before Ludwig. The eye collector is not a hunter, but if she's collecting eyes, then she probably picked up a blood-drunk eye and ended up here the same way that we did. There's also crows nearby. Crows eat eyes. Maybe they ate a blood-drunk eye and got snatched out of the sky by an amygdala. Okay. Then there's beast patients. The beast patients aren't hunters, but if you watch the introductory cinematic of the game, you can see that some people who are partially transformed into beasts have the blood-drunk eye. So, okay, maybe these are people who got blood-drunk and they turned into beasts and then they got grabbed and sent to the nightmare. Then there are members of the Healing Church who don't seem to be blood-drunk, but okay, maybe the Healing Church intentionally sends people into the nightmare to make sure no one gets to the hamlet. As you can see, the excuses are getting more and more tenuous. Then we hit the research hall and it becomes impossible to keep making excuses. There are the research hall patients, there's the living failures, and there's Adeline. They're not hunters, and there's no way an amygdala grabbed them by accident. And there's also the oddness, for example, of the corpses in Ludwig's room, who appear to have individual consciousness to the point where they can try to escape from Ludwig and beg us to help them. But who are they? Where did they come from? Okay, they could be people that he killed, but the nightmare explicitly grows from the fishing hamlet and it's connected to the hunters. Not everyone ends up here, so why are they here? And then there's these things, these church giant executioner squid hybrids with the axes that I don't even know. I mean, did these things actually exist? So while we used to be able to say, okay, there's a division here, there's stuff that naturally occurred in the nightmare because it's made out of bits and pieces of Laurence, and then there's things that have come into the nightmare from outside. Now we have this sort of nebulous third category of things that just kind of seem to be there. Now, previously in the Dreamlands, we've seen areas that are basically patchworks of bits and pieces of the waking world. The most obvious being the Hunter's Nightmare itself, which has two copies of the same building existing within walking distance of each other. On the basis of what we find in the Hunter's Nightmare, and particularly in the research hall, it looks as though, I guess we'll call them consciousnesses, can be created in the nightmare out of patchwork bits in the same way that we see locations created. The only prior example of something like this that we'd seen was the doll, who was inanimate in the waking world, but alive in the Dreamlands. And the doll was obviously a very important character in the story, so it kind of made sense for her to stand out as unique. The thing about the Hunter's Nightmare, though, is that we come face to face, not technically face, we meet Adeline. What Adeline is going through is explicitly described as something that happened in the early days of the Healing Church. But as far as she is concerned, and as far as everything else in the research hall is concerned, this is happening in the present. Now, if this were the real Adeline, either snatched by an amygdala or trapped here after she died, this would already have happened to her. But as far as she's concerned, it's happening now, and we're actually playing a part in it. Ludwig and German are both explicitly aware that they entered the Dreamlands and they've been there for some time.
Are my church hunters the honourable Spartans? I hoped they would be.
Oh, Laurence, what's taking you so long?
Mikolash probably is.
Now I'm waking up! I'll forget everything!
But then Adeline has no continuity to her. In other words, Adeline, and by extension everyone else in the research hall, looks like a facsimile of the real thing that's been conjured up out of memories, probably Maria's, rather than something that's entered from the outside, and yet despite being a facsimile, they have free will, and will persist after whoever created them has gone. So we're now left with a situation where a lot of the monsters we run into in the Dreamlands might not be native creatures to these strange dimensions or creatures from the waking world. They might just be things that were conjured up and given life by some consciousness that had some influence over the Dreamlands. It's not an earth-shattering revelation. It's something a lot of other people had suggested. Redgrave had suggested something like this before the DLC landed. But I wanted to get it laid out like this because it's going to be important in the next set of things I'm going to discuss. So, with the benefit of the DLC, we now know that the doll is explicitly based on a real person, and that real person is Maria, who was German's apprentice. It looks like German probably built her because German was obsessed. The doll comes to life in the Dreamlands and is not possessed by Maria's spirit, but is linked to Maria, so that even though the doll appears completely unaware of Maria's existence, should we defeat Maria in the clock tower, the doll will feel it. So that basically answers what's going on, but it doesn't tell us why it's happening or how it's happening, and that's what I want to look at in this section. So, German building a doll is not beyond German technically, since he seems to be the guy who pioneered the transforming weapons, so mechanisms of that kind are something that he's familiar with. So the articulated mechanical doll is something that he would have been able to build. So that part of it makes sense, at least to me. The problem is that nothing we see or hear of German suggests any kind of sentimentality. He has no problems massacring the fishing hamlet. He continues to work with Laurence after everything goes wrong. He positively relishes the chance to fight us if we refuse to let him behead us. So even if German was completely obsessed with Maria, the construction of a doll is very out of character based on our experiences with German. There's also the detail, which I pointed out originally, that German basically ignores the doll, and when he does acknowledge her, he sounds disturbed and kind of repulsed.
You're welcome to use whatever you find. Even the doll, should it please you.
So whatever plan he had for the doll, this doesn't seem to have been it. Likewise, the doll just talks about German as if he's her superior, not someone she's specifically invested in caring for.
He was a hunter long, long ago, but now serves only to advise them. He is obscure, unseen in the dreaming world. Still, he stays here, in this dream. Such is his purpose.
The next point is that the doll, in every way other than the physical and vocal resemblance, is the opposite of Maria. The Maria that we meet in the clock tower is a very cold, ruthless person whose immediate response to us touching her corpse is to try to kill us. And she's actually worse in the Japanese script, because in English, well, she says, "An honest death will cure us of our wild curiosity." In the Japanese version, she outright says she's going to give us a horrifying death that will scare us away from ever coming back. And then, of course, later on we find out that Maria played a part in the raid on the fishing hamlet, killing civilians who were just trying to defend themselves before defiling their god's corpse. And more importantly, that she was Gehrman's apprentice and that they fought together. In contrast to that, the doll is this extremely idealized, domesticated wife/mother figure who just wants us to be happy and doesn't care if we shoot her in the face. So there's a number of fairly key differences. Now, when the DLC first dropped and we were discussing this, the argument was put forth that basically Gehrman's obsession with Maria led to him idealizing her as his waifu, and that he made the doll in that image, and that's why the doll behaves in this way that doesn't fit with Maria. My problem with this, and it's fairly massive, is that Maria was Gehrman's apprentice as a hunter. They worked very closely together in this mentor-student relationship. In order for them to function like this, they would have to know each other very well. Just because Gehrman was obsessed with Maria doesn't mean that he admired her from afar and put this idealized mental image of her on a pedestal. The exact nature of the relationship isn't that well communicated, which the way it's written actually makes it seem quite one-sided. It says that Maria had great admiration for Gehrman, unaware of his curious mania. The reference to curious mania hints at his obsession with her, but it's not very clear because curious mania is a very weird turn of phrase. So while the game points toward Gehrman having this obsession with Maria, it doesn't point toward him having the doll as a mental image of her. Also, keep in mind that Gehrman doesn't actually like the doll. If the doll represented some sort of idealized partner, you'd think he would at least acknowledge her, but they never actually seem to spend any time together in the hunter's dream. So the fact Gehrman was obsessed doesn't mean the obsession took the form of some sort of sexual desire and that he wanted to retire with Maria and form a little nuclear family unit where he doted on her. It could have been something a lot more disturbing and strange that we're not privy to, especially given that she was a relative of Annalise, which makes her part Thumerian. But the real stumbling block for the whole situation is simply that we only experience Gehrman at the very end of his life when he's a very damaged person after everything he's been through. So it's not clear what he was like as a younger man. Given the state Gehrman is in right now, it's virtually certain he wasn't always like this, but we never get a clearer picture of what he was like. You can say the same thing about Maria as well. She's a character who we really only know at the end of her life, after she's gone through a number of apparently extremely psychologically damaging experiences, including what looks to be a suicide attempt. So it's possible that she wasn't always as ruthless as the person that we find. At some point in her life, she may actually have been a very compassionate person, and the psychological toll of being a hunter sort of turned her into this. The point is, though, if Gehrman really did want Maria back, seeing her come back as this, rather than the person he remembers, might explain why he doesn't really want to acknowledge the doll. So, while the doll is nothing like the Maria that we fight, she is a lot like the Maria that we hear about but never meet, and that's the Maria that the patients in the research hall keep referring to. We learn from the Rakuyo that one day Maria cast it into a well because she could no longer stomach its presence. The well we find it in is in the fishing hamlet where the hunters massacred the population and desecrated the body of Kos, so you can infer fairly reasonably that she was overcome with guilt for what she'd done there. There's also the lumen flower we find on the gravestone overlooking Kos's body, and since Maria presides over the Lumen Wood Gardens and has the dial that opens the clock, she's probably responsible for the flower being left there in memory of what happened. Now, in spite of presiding over the Lumen Flower Gardens and living in the clock, what does Maria actually do? The astral clock tower key just calls her the caretaker, and from what the patients say to us and from what we're told about her relationship with Adeline, the impression is that Maria's role in the research hall is simply to comfort the patients and relieve their suffering. They know her by name and they call out for her, and some of them ask her to take them by the hand as if this were a regular occurrence. So she appears to be a kind of Mother Teresa figure. But at the same time, Maria doesn't appear to wield any kind of institutional power within the hall. She doesn't appear to be in charge of it, and she also doesn't seem to be involved in any of the research that's going on. The test case is the relationship between Maria and Adeline. Maria explicitly did not want Adeline to become a blood saint, but she was unable to actually stop her. All Maria could do after Adeline had made that decision was to give Adeline the key to the balcony in the hopes that the smell of the lumen flowers would comfort her. So Maria had no control over that situation. The most she could do was to find a way to alleviate some of Adeline's suffering. Why this has happened seems to be tied back to Maria throwing away the Rakuyo. If she's overcome with guilt to the point where she can't stand the presence of her sword anymore, and she's leaving flowers at the graves of people that she's killed, then her later life as the caretaker would seem to be motivated by a desire to basically atone for what she had done. So she goes from someone who inflicts suffering to someone who alleviates suffering. So this Maria, the one that we hear about from the patients and the one that is the caretaker, rather than the one that we fight, is a good match for the doll. You can actually very easily imagine a lot of the doll's lines being said by Maria to the patients in the hall as she was comforting them.
Lady Maria, please take my hand. Please help me.
I will be here for you to embolden your sickly spirit. Let me stand close. Now shut your eyes.
But the most compelling piece of evidence is that when we defeat Maria's consciousness in the research hall, the doll is transformed by it.
Have I somehow changed? Moments ago, from some place, perhaps deep within, I sensed a liberation from heavy shackles.
So the link exists between Maria and the doll, not the doll and Gurman, or the doll and the Great Ones, or the doll and something else. Defeating Gurman or the Moon Presence doesn't change the doll, but defeating Maria does. So even though the doll doesn't know who Maria is, she still, in some way, came from Maria. Now I want to look at why there is a doll at all and why we find her in the workshop. Beginning with the grave of Gurman's apprentice. Gurman's apprentice was most likely Maria. The doll is drawn to the grave. The item we get from the grave allows us to quicken, which is something that Maria could do. The use of male pronouns on the bone is a translation convention from Japanese to English. Japanese as a language doesn't use pronouns. So in cases like this, the translator has defaulted to using male pronouns because they just assumed the character was male, even though it's not actually specified. This is something that's happened in the Souls series before. The character of Ulan in Demon Souls and the character of Faris in Dark Souls are both female characters, but they're referred to in the text with male pronouns. And if Gurman was obsessed with Maria, it makes sense that she would be buried at Gurman's workshop. So the simplest explanation is that this is Maria's grave, and we're carrying around one of her bones. As for how Maria died, we're told that Maria made her home behind the giant star-interpreting clock, which implies she wasn't hanging out at the workshop with Gurman during the research hall phase of her life. And it also explains why her area of the Dreamlands is modelled on the clock tower rather than another version of the Hunter's Dream. So in other words, Gurman and Maria seem to have been separated for some time before Maria actually died. The state that we find Maria in the Hunter's Nightmare looks a lot like suicide. She's in a locked room, her throat's been slit, and as I've brought up before, she seems to be someone who was overcome with guilt. On the table next to her is a photograph that some people have tried to figure out what's actually in the frame. I can sometimes make out figures in it, and sometimes I can't. I think it's like a Rorschach test thing. There's a photograph missing from the hunter's dream above the fireplace. So it looks like Maria took that with her to the research hall as a memento of her time with Gurman. This isn't the only memento in the situation, though. In the abandoned old workshop, we find a hair ornament. The doll reacts to the hair ornament when we give it to her, but the hair ornament doesn't seem to be the doll's. The description doesn't mention the doll, it's not found with the doll's set, the doll herself isn't wearing it, and the doll doesn't recognize it, although she can feel a connection to it. It also specifies that it would look good against grey hair. So, this is probably Maria's hair ornament, that either she left here as a memento to Gurman in the same way that she took a photograph, or else Gurman removed it from her body before she was buried. So I'm going to assume that what happened was Maria left the workshop, went to the research hall, lived in the research hall for some time, then she killed herself in the hall and her body was taken back to the workshop where it was buried. Given that her grave is in the same place in both the waking world and the dreamlands, this probably happened prior to the creation of the Hunter's Dream. The problem with assuming her waking world death mirrors her appearance in the dreamlands, though, is that when we find her in the dreamlands, she's wearing her old hunter set and she's got her rakuyo again. While she might have kept wearing the hunter set, she really shouldn't still have the rakuyo. Although, if consciousnesses are shaping how they appear in the dreamlands, then Maria appearing in the dreamlands as her old self, the self she tried to basically repress by becoming this healer, it could just be that that's still how she sees herself. I mean, if the nightmare can create 2 cathedrals, it can create an extra rakuyo. And on the subject of the clothes, the set that the doll wears isn't some random Yharnam set. It's actually pretty closely patterned on what Maria wore as a hunter, so this might actually be what Maria wore when she worked in the research hall. Maria's set comes from Canehurst, and we only really find out what the Canehurst knights and nobility wore. So what we know as the doll set could be what women of a lower class in Canehurst wore. Although, to throw a spanner in the works again, the description of the doll's set makes it seem very much like the set was made by whoever made the doll. This weirdly implies Gurman is a fashion designer. So I think it's more likely that he just copied Maria's existing clothing. But why is there a doll at all other than Gurman was obsessed? We read a lot about how much care and attention was lavished on the doll, but the only hint we get as to why she was built comes from the Tearstone gem. This blood gem is a quiet but unfaltering friend that continually restores HP, the life essence of a hunter. Perhaps the doll's creator had wished for just such a friend, albeit in vain. Now again, there is some ambiguous sentence structure here, so I'll try to clear it up. When the text describes the gem as a quiet but unfaltering friend and then later says the doll's creator had wished for such a friend, it is referring back to the gem. It's not saying the doll's creator was lonely and wished for a friend. It's saying that the gem contains within it what the doll's creator wished in vain would reside within the doll. The Japanese is a lot clearer. More literal translation of the line would be something like, perhaps this is the essence which the doll's creator hoped in vain that she would possess. So we learned 2 things from this. Firstly, the doll was created with a purpose in mind, and that purpose was, roughly, to provide support and encouragement. So even before she came to life and began to care for us, she was designed to be a carer. The second thing we find out is that for some unspecified reason, the doll never fulfilled her intended purpose. She was supposed to provide healing and support, but she didn't, and that's presumably why we find her abandoned in the old workshop with all the other junk. Aggravatingly, the doll's purpose is still couched in very vague language. The talk of her as an unfaltering friend who provides comfort to hunters doesn't give us the specifics of what her actual functions were intended to be. In the Dreamlands, she literally does make us stronger, and the tear gem literally does heal our wounds, whereas in the waking world, the doll is simply a limp doll whose finger sometimes twitches. So, given that Gurman outright tells us that
hunters used blood to enhance their weapons and flesh,
then constructing something with the purpose of channeling blood into something that makes you stronger, that's not entirely out of the question. She'd basically be a humanoid version of the Blood Gem Workshop tool. But even if they had planned that and it didn't work out, it doesn't explain why it's a doll and why it's a doll based on Maria. If the support she's supposed to offer is of a more abstract sort, though, it could simply mean that the doll was meant to fill the void that Maria left by providing something to remember her by. So if Maria's death somehow broke Gurman psychologically and the doll was an attempt to replace her, that also didn't work. So Gurman wasn't comforted by the doll in the waking world and doesn't appear to be comforted by her in the Dreamlands either. So annoyingly, there's still this gap in our understanding of the doll. There are parameters in which an explanation of the doll has to reasonably fit, but the parameters themselves are so wide that you could kind of come up with anything and we could be here all night. So now I want to look at the doll from another perspective, and that's the perspective of the Winter Lanterns. So to begin with a clarification, Winter Lanterns are very specifically dolls. They're not a monster that happens to be in the doll's clothing, and you can see this if you look at their fingers. The fingers are very clearly jointed, like the doll's fingers. Although curiously, they don't have feet. They just have masses of tentacle that are roughly foot-shaped. Now, back in the original video I did on this, I said that the Winter Lanterns were likely other dolls, physical copies of the doll, that had been brought into the nightmare from outside and basically gone evil because they were treated badly, while our doll was nice because she'd been treated respectfully. This came from Japanese folklore around objects having souls and then coming to life later on based on how they're treated. But we learned two significant things in the DLC. The first is that things in the nightmare can be spontaneously created. The second thing we learned about lanterns in the DLC is that they don't just exist in areas where Mensis have a foothold. I'd previously argued that they were linked with Mensis because we found a bunch of them in the Nightmare of Mensis and then a couple in the Frontier which is connected to the Nightmare of Mensis. But what we learn in the DLC is that there's two of them in the fishing hamlet, which is somewhere where we see no evidence that Mensis have a foothold. And it actually seems like Mensis's inability to access the fishing hamlet is a plot point, but I'll come to that later on. But specifically, the ones we find in the fishing hamlet are found in a well, which is the same well that Maria threw away her Rakuyo. Since the lanterns are based on the doll, and the doll is based on Maria, there's no way that's a coincidence. So now back to Mensis, specifically Mensis's giant brain. It's easy to draw parallels between the Mensis brain and the lanterns, since both of them are giant clumps of brain matter and eyes that appear to be made from messengers, and they both have this attack that inflicts frenzy on you by creating these blood spears. Now, the blood spears are very, very odd, not least because they are actually spears. These aren't gouts of blood. They have defined handles and hilts and what look like rivets in them. There's a common misconception that the spears are the result of being frenzied in the same way that purple clouds denote poison and the sort of steam effect denotes beasthood. This isn't how it works. The spears are the result of an attack that the brain and the lanterns are doing to us, which drains our hit points gradually, and as it's draining the hit points, it's inflicting frenzy. So it's the experience of having our blood torn out of our body and formed into these spears that's frenzying us, not that frenzy makes the spears occur. If we're frenzied by another source, like the Gardens of Eyes or the Celestial Children, you won't see the spears, you'll just see the explosion of blood when the frenzy bar fills. The only enemies that use this particular attack are the lanterns and the Mensis brain, although the spears themselves are used to attack us directly rather than sucking blood out of our bodies by the Thumerian Eldar and by Yharnam. The Bloodletter weapon also has a roughly similar effect when it's in its transformed mode. The spikes are a lot less refined, but they are still spikes made of blood, and transforming the Bloodletter does induce frenzy. So it looks like this attack represents some sort of advanced form of blood manipulation that only the Thumerians and the brain monsters ever really got a handle on. So that's the similarities, but there's also a fair number of differences. The Mensis brain has defined arms with hands and fingers, whereas when the lantern grabs you, it doesn't actually have arms, it just has clumps of tentacles that sort of emerge from the sides of it and form into roughly hand-shaped blobs. It also tries to grab you with its doll hands, but those are the hands of the doll, not the hands of the brain. The lantern brains are also covered in tentacles, whereas the Mensis brain isn't, it just has the two arms and the two what look like legs. The lantern brains have mouths, the Mensis brain doesn't, but the Mensis brain has hair, while the lanterns don't. And in terms of design, the Mensis brain is basically a lot messier and less symmetrical. So to me, the key difference is that the lanterns look like a brain that's been fused to a body that lets it walk around, kind of like Krang, while the Mensis brain looks more like it's the nervous system of something roughly humanoid that's been ripped out of it and strung up on these chains. Now, I think this actually might be kind of a red herring, because Bloodborne makes a big deal repeatedly about eyes on the inside, which the game renders very directly as physical eyes that are growing on your brain. They're not a theory that Willem had independently, they're something that the game's world acknowledges as a specific way in which you attain enlightenment. So when looking at the Mensis brain and the lanterns, we don't necessarily need to say that the resemblance between the two means that they're related, because a giant brain covered in eyes is a kind of telos. It's not that they share a common ancestor, it's that anything that's becoming sufficiently enlightened will tend toward the form of a giant brain covered in eyes. You can see this, for example, in the amygdala. You can see it in the Gardens of Eyes, you can see it in Rom, you can see it in the Romlets, and very interestingly, you can see it perhaps in the Research Hall. What lanterns have more in common with than any other enemy in the game, I would argue, is the Research Hall patients. The patients are humanoids with gigantic swollen pulsing brains, and if you remove the wrap, you could potentially see something very much like a winter lantern underneath. We also find patients whose bodies have atrophied and been absorbed into their heads, and those patients have the ability to extrude tentacles from their bodies, and also to latch onto you and bite you in the same way that the lantern does. Some of them can even inflict frenzy on you, although it's not in the form of the blood spike attack, but it's still frenzy. The lanterns also make a sound. Not the singing, but they make a sound as their brains pulsate. I think that might be the sticky sound that the Hall patients talk about. We certainly hear something very similar when Adeline's brain pulses after being given brain fluid. Sticky sound is a very odd way of putting it. If we look at the Japanese script, instead of saying sticky sound, it says something like the wet sound or the moist sound, which is a better, I think, description of the sort of slopping, gurgling noise that the brains make. As for the singing, I don't think there's anything in the game that suggests what the singing is supposed to be, but it could be something like the way the patients keep saying plip, plop, drip, drop, and talking about the howl of the sea and the voice of the ocean. If you imagine that rendered as a kind of song, that could be why the lanterns are singing. The big difference here, though, is the number of eyes. The patients in the hall are capable of grabbing your blood echoes, and when they do, they only have two eyes. This is true of the bodiless heads, it's true of the regular patients that run around it, and it's also true of the living failures. So it doesn't look like anyone in the research hall actually developed internal eyes, with the possible exception of Adeline. Adeline can't take our blood echoes, so we can't say for certain how many eyes she has, but the brain fluid we give her is described as the initial makings of internal eyes, and she's the only subject of the hall whose experience seems to have led anywhere. eventually discovering the milkweed rune. So prior to her death, Adeline might have had multiple eyes under there. By the end of her questline, Adeline is just a head, and we know from the other patients that we've seen that are just heads that those brains can extrude tentacles, they can grab you, and they can bite you, and they can inflict frenzy. So if you grabbed what was left of Adeline, took the bandages off and stuck it to the top of the doll, you might have something like a winter lantern. And as I mentioned before, we find 2 winter lanterns in the well where Maria threw away her rakuyo in an attempt to break from her past as a hunter. So the way it looks to me is that lanterns are a composite of everything Maria was tortured by before and after her death, a kind of manifestation of her guilty conscience. So they combine the doll, which is this creepy attempt to replace her, with the atrocities that she watched happen passively in the research hall, and possibly also this Thumerian or Canehurst heritage in the form of the blood manipulation attack, which is something she seems to want to distance herself from. So in the same way that there are these beasts, and there are these corpses, and there are these, whatever these are, that seem to be created out of memories and out of feelings of the people that are trapped here in the same way that the architecture is, it looks like Maria's kind of contribution is the lanterns. So before being done with the lanterns, I want to talk briefly about what the name Winter Lantern actually means. Redgrave has made a video called Little Things in Yharnam, Flowers, where he talks at length about what Winter Lantern means. You should watch the whole thing, but to give you an extremely compressed summary, the Winter Lantern is a name given to a species of flower called the Hazuki, that's shaped kind of like a paper lantern, and it's a perennial flower, so it grows in winter, hence Winter Lantern. These flowers are offered to the deceased during this annual Buddhist festival called the Bon Festival, and it's believed that they will help guide the spirits of the dead through the afterlife like a lantern. So that's clearly relevant given that where we find our lanterns seems to be analogous to the afterlife. So I'm not disagreeing with anything he says there, but there are some things I want to add to it. A lot of the creatures in Bloodborne, particularly things from the Dreamlands, they don't have proper names, they have descriptive names. So, while you have things like Ibriatus, Daughter of the Cosmos, and Rom, the Vacuous Spider, you also have enemies that are literally called, like, Crawling Thing, Fishman, Snail Woman, and so on, which is just a description of what they are. And you can detect a kind of a motif or just a preference in these names toward likening things to plants. An example that's kind of lost in translation is the amygdala. Amygdala is called an amygdala not purely because the amygdala is a part of the brain that's related to fear, but because the word amygdala also means almond, and the amygdala's heads and the stone we use to contact them look a lot like almonds. So that's where the name comes from. And in Japanese, they are in fact called almondosa, which is just a literal reading of the word almond. So this isn't like Ebrietus or Rom, where amygdala is its name. Amygdala here is used because when they first encountered them, they looked like an almond. Likewise, we have this creature here called the fluorescent flower, which is literally just a fluorescent flower. In Japanese, it's called the firefly flower. So this is not a scientific name for the thing, it's just a description of what we found, a fluorescent flower with a monster attached. So, if you look at a Hazuki flower that's been dried, it kinda looks like a winter lantern's head. It's got a seed in the middle around which this lattice is growing. So you can kind of liken the look of it to a human head that's been consumed by this weird sort of irregularly patterned brain tissue. So on top of the symbolism involved in the Bon Festival, I'd say the name also suggests that it's just meant to look a bit like a Hazuki flower.